Hello and welcome to today's PIR live event webinar brought to you by Partners in Research Canada. My name is Stacey Joyce and I'll be your host. Remember that you can ask your questions by typing them into the chat function in the top left-hand side of your screen, and make sure you include your name, your school, or city so we can give you a shout out when we ask your question. Today's guest is Michael Geller. He is an adjunct faculty member at the Center for Sustainable Community Development at Simon Fraser University. He's also an architect and planner and a real estate developer. Thank you so much for joining us. I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, Stacey. I'm pleased today to tell you a little bit about how the community in which you live gets designed and built. As Stacey mentioned, I'm an architect and a planner and a real estate developer. And in this presentation, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what each of those roles undertakes when it comes to community building. I'm also going to talk to you a little bit about what creates sustainable communities. What do we mean by that? And hopefully give you a few ideas so that when you walk around your community, you'll begin to see the buildings and the parks in a different light. So I have always wanted to be an architect. I started off as a child enjoying art and mathematics, and people said you should become an architect, and so I did. And as you can see from this picture, architects design all kinds of buildings. This is an apartment building, but it's not in a Canadian city. It happens to be in Russia, where I've been doing some work. Architects design larger houses, they design apartment buildings, and they design the shops that you go to, and they also design schools as well. The one thing that architects also do is they don't just design the buildings, they also prepare the working drawings so that the builders can have blueprints from which to work, although we no longer call them blueprints. Now, a community planner is like an architect in that they not only design buildings, but they also design whole communities. And this is an example of a new town. Many of you may say it doesn't look like anywhere I've been. Actually, this is a portion of a town in Germany, Freiburg, Germany, where you'll see there are no single-family homes. Everybody lives in an apartment. There's an overall design. There's a transportation network. The homes are designed so that people can get to the tram or the bus. People generally don't use cars. You don't see lots of parking space in this community. And so for an architect and a planner to work on a development like this, it's a very special opportunity. Now, what does the developer do? Well, it's the developer who hires the architect after buying the land. He then hires the builder. He's the one who has to get the approvals from City Hall. And overall, he is the one who is responsible for making sure that everything gets built in accordance to the plans, and ultimately is responsible for either selling or renting the housing or leasing up the shops, or if it's the case of a school, it's rare that a developer will get involved in building a school. But actually, this is changing. In some new communities, it's the developer who builds the school as well and hands it over to the school board and the teachers to then look after. So I often tell my friends, creating communities is a bit like making movies, where the developer is like the producer. Think of me as Steven Spielberg when I'm the developer. The architect is more like the director. And then the builder is really like the cinematographer. Then there's going to be a real estate agent. He's like the person who markets the buildings. He decides, how do you make sure that people will come? And I often joke, though, that as you look at some of the new buildings around our cities, the architect also wants to be the star of the movie as well. One of the questions I'm often asked is, how do you know what is going to be built in different parts of the city? The way this is managed is through something called zoning. In the old days, we used to create zoning so that we could separate the noxious industrial uses from where people lived, because we were worried about their health. Today, we don't necessarily have exactly the same concern, but we do zone the city so that certain areas are commercial, certain areas are residential, and other areas might be industrial. As part of the zoning, we also decide how much park space should be provided and so forth. This is a recent three-dimensional zoning map of Vancouver, where I live. And as you can see, there's different colors representing different parts of the city. The turquoise blue are the industrial areas. The yellow is the housing. The red is the commercial areas, although sometimes there can be housing above the commercial areas. And so this begins, and then the purple, those are special zones, custom designed for each building in that part of the city. So this is the way that we often determine how the overall plan is made. The trouble is, though, that over time, our attitudes change. It's necessary to do what we call rezoning, where we will change the zoning for one particular piece of property. So it might go from industrial to residential, or it might go from residential to commercial. One of the terms that you no doubt hear a lot about is sustainable development. That's really what we're all trying to do today. We're trying to create communities which will be as delightful places or even better places for you to live and your children to live in years and decades to come. One of the ways we do that is by starting to think about how many resources are we using? Are we cutting down all the trees? Are we using up all the water? Are we ensuring that there's adequate green space and healthy air? And so in the city of Vancouver, a great deal of emphasis is being placed on creating a green city, a sustainable city. And I suspect many of you live in communities that are thinking exactly the same way. A number of years ago, I had the opportunity to work on the planning of a new community next to Simon Fraser University. And we decided to try and make that a model sustainable community, which other, both universities, but other cities across Canada could emulate. And so people often ask me, well, what made the university community so sustainable? Well, one of the things is people were encouraged not to get in their car every time they had to go somewhere. We designed it so that they could be close to the shops. We designed it so they could take transit down to the Vancouver if they needed to move off the mountain. And we also included things like car share. Do you have car share in your community? So that each person didn't have to own their own car. And we also designed it so it'd be an attractive place to walk and to cycle. The homes themselves were designed to use less energy, less water. And in this case, you can see we actually included a small childcare facility within an apartment complex that was designed for families with children. One of the interesting things about our community was that we decided that we would convey the idea of a healthy community even through the types of restaurants. There's no McDonald's, imagine that, no McDonald's at University, but there is Nature's Garden, there are other businesses that sell healthier food choices. It's just a small gesture, but the idea is to think about different ways of living to contribute to a healthy lifestyle. One of the things about University is that the school is built right in the center of the community, and it's designed so that children can actually walk to school or ride their bikes to school. We deliberately did not provide a lot of parking spaces around the school just to discourage parents from driving their kids to school. In the old days, as I'm sure your parents and grandparents have told you, kids didn't always get driven to school. And I think one of the ways we make healthier places is by walking more and driving less. So I hope this has given you some idea as to what goes into the planning of a new community, what the role of the architect is, the planner, the developer, as well as the important people at City Hall who oversee the planning. One of the things that I would like to conclude with is if you ever come to Vancouver, one of the things you'll notice is we don't have a lot of expressways running through the center of our city. That's something we stopped back in the 1970s. And to those of you who are living in cities where the planners and the politicians keep wanting to build more and more expressways, just tell them to come to Vancouver and see how delightful a city can be when there's a greater emphasis on walking, on cycling, on using public transit. I hope this has been of interest to you, and I look forward to any questions you might have.
Well, thank you so much for that. If you can go ahead and take your slides down, we just have a few questions here to get to. It's interesting that you mentioned the lack of highways in Vancouver, because my first question here is from a group in Calgary, and they were mentioning that the city is building more lanes for their highway. What are the benefits and drawbacks of this, and what alternatives are there given an existing community that is relying on its highway?
You know, for years and years, we've often thought that the way to address traffic congestion is simply to make the roads wider, to add more bridges, to build more expressways. And what we've discovered over time is it simply doesn't work. It works in the short term, but it doesn't work in the long term. And at the end of the day, what we find is that these highways, these expressways, they separate communities, they make it more difficult for people to cycle and to walk. One of my colleagues once said that trying to address congestion by building more highways is like trying to address your weight loss by simply loosening your belt. It doesn't work. And so I do hope that students who are living in cities where the politicians and the planners are still stuck in this old-fashioned idea of building more and more expressways will speak out. Because believe me, when you go to European communities, when you go to some of the other smaller towns across Canada, which have not been ripped apart by expressways, you realize it's a much nicer environment.
Right. I like that analogy. It's very easy to think about that and think how that just wouldn't work if you loosen your belt as a potential solution. There must be some research as well to investigate that and to really prove that idea. Who performs that type of research?
Well, I think that there's a movement in the United States and as well in Canada called smart growth. And if people just Google smart growth, they'll begin to see what are some of the principles of creating sustainable communities and alternatives to providing highways. There's a wonderful infographic you'll see which shows how much space you need for a highway accommodating 50 people each in their own car versus how much space you need for a bus accommodating those same 50 people, or indeed how much space do you need if they're all on bicycles or on or walking. And so there's a lot of information. Even the transportation engineers who write their own reports and the engineers, they're beginning to get it. They realize that just building more and more roads is not the answer.
Okay. So how do developers decide when and where to add things like bike lanes or even public transit routes to an existing city that they're trying to retrofit these items into?
Well, it's interesting. Often it's the developers in many instances who are opposing the creation of bike lanes, especially some of the older developers who just don't get it. But one of the things that the developers in Vancouver and Toronto and Montreal have discovered is that when you create new public transit systems, that's actually where people want to live. And indeed, we're beginning to see more and more apartments and taller apartments being built around those transit stations because developers realize that's where people want to live. Similarly, increasingly, they build office buildings near transit because a lot of the employees simply don't want to have to drive to work and then pay expensive parking fees. And so what we're beginning to see is something called Transit-Oriented Development, TOD. That's a very accepted expression in our industry because so often, if you look now at Canadian cities and especially cities around the world, you'll see that where people live, where the higher density of buildings is often closely related to the transit station. And indeed, at one time it used to be that properties next to a subway or in Vancouver, a SkyTrain would be a lower value because of the noise. Today, those are the most valuable properties because increasingly people don't want to own cars. Many of the people watching us right now, they don't believe it, but they're not necessarily going to want to have a car as much as I did when I turned 16 or 18.
It's true. When you think of the time that you spend commuting in a large city on those highways, it's not necessarily something that people look forward to the same way they maybe did decades ago. So just enough time for a couple more questions. The first question is, what is one of your favorite projects that you have worked on in the past?
Well, certainly the university development is one of my favorite projects because it was an opportunity to literally start from scratch and try to design a town where people would enjoy living, where they could live healthier lifestyles, and where they could also live more affordable lifestyles. And because the university was involved in building this town, we also used it as a bit of a laboratory to test out new ideas. For instance, how can you design roads where the water, rather than simply going to sewers, can return back into the ground? How can you design, as I mentioned, a school in the heart of the community where kids can walk to school rather than always have to drive or get on a bus? One of the other things we did, working with the municipality of Burnaby, was develop a curriculum within the school with a special focus on environmental issues, something that should happen in all schools, but is certainly happening up at university. So that's one of my favorite projects. But I've also been involved in a couple of other developments, one in Richmond, where we redeveloped an old industrial property on the waterfront into a whole new community. We were able to create boardwalks along the waterfront. We were able to preserve some of the old buildings and bring them back to life. We were able to offer quite a wide range of housing choices. So it wasn't just all single-family houses or all apartments. It was a mix. And we were able to bring in new shops very close by so that people didn't have to get into a car to go to the store. And at first people said, I'm not so sure I really need to live in this area. I mean, it's not traditionally a place where people live. Today, it's one of the most popular parts of Metro Vancouver, and other similar industrial lands are being redeveloped. So that is another one that I'm very proud of.
Well, those sound wonderful. The last question I have for you today is what students can pursue in their schooling and as they're trying to gain experiences if they would like to become involved in sustainable community development. How can they sort of train themselves and get themselves ready?
I mentioned earlier that people encouraged me to become an architect because I was good at art and I was good at mathematics. And what I've discovered in the last 45 years since I graduated is that, in fact, those are important, but they're not necessarily the most important things. That, in fact, as an architect, you need to also understand psychology and sociology. You need to understand human behavior. You have to be reasonably good at public speaking. You have to be a good listener and be good at communications. And the same holds true, I think, for all of the disciplines involved in the creation of new communities and new buildings. It's a very multidisciplinary thing. In other words, just because you're not good at art today doesn't mean that you shouldn't become or couldn't become an architect, because in fact, it's changed. So much of the work is now done on computers. It's just like even if you can't spell, if you can use spell check, it doesn't matter. Same holds true if you can't draw. But I think being involved in planning, in architecture, in development, ideally it should attract people who are interested in creating things. And it should also attract people who are interested in just how we live, because at the end of the day, it's the most important thing. I often told people you should move into my developments because you might actually live longer. Not something we often think about when we think about buildings, but people who are at school right now know some schools are more beautifully designed and it makes it more interesting and more attractive to come to school than those that are literally falling apart. So I hope that this little presentation will encourage some people who may never have even thought about becoming an architect or a planner or one day going into property development to think about that as an alternative career choice.
Well, I think so. I certainly learned a lot myself. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to everyone who's joined us today. That's all the time we have. If you would like to learn more about some upcoming PIR live event webinars, you can go to pirweb.org and see our upcoming schedule. Thanks again so much for joining us.